you for joining us today in this broadcast as we cover 5 ways to increase desk utilisation. In today's session, we'll look at some of the key metrics you need to care about when it comes to increasing workspace occupancy. We'll also cover the data points that will help you make informed changes to better utilise workspace and then highlight the key takeaways. At the end of the broadcast, we'll cover any of the questions you've asked during the webcast and also those that were sent in to us by email. Introducing to you our speakers, we're joined today by Yodit Stanton, CEO and founder of OpenSensors, and Vu Gwen, our head of product innovation. Now I would like to hand you over to Yodit, so let's jump straight in.
Thank you everyone for your time today. My name is Yodit. My background is around data analytics. Really the intention of this session is to take you through some of the terminology used around utilization optimization. We're going to focus on desks in this session. The reason we did this is to give you very nitty-gritty how-tos on changes to make and ensure that you get the best out of some of the data sets that you're gathering. When we're talking about data, we're talking about 2 ways that people historically gather data. Obviously, most of you are familiar with manual surveys. You might do it already or know people that gather data in this way. Manual surveys really refers to when people are sending people around with clipboards. They're gathering data maybe once an hour on a floor over a 2 or 3 week period. Sensors are becoming the norm in terms of understanding utilization over the last couple of years, especially. We see a lot of adoption of sensor technology. And the reason people adopt sensors, you're getting data, much more granular data, 10-minute data over a much longer period of time. So, months and years, really. And the key difference is with manual surveys, for example, is people have a manual survey maybe once every 6 months or before big moves and big real estate events. With sensors, people are gathering data, but they're making a lot of much more iterative changes, being a little bit more agile around the way they think about space. And change that comes from it. I think it's important just before we start to go into what are the key metrics and really start with the definition. So average utilization, as most of you are aware, is around what is the averages, what is the norms over a period of time. Average utilization, when we talk about that, tends to be over a daily period or 2 week period or whatever, but what is the average over that time? Peak indicates when the office or the desks are busiest. So if you hit a peak on one particular hour or one particular day, it could just be that you've had an all hands meeting that particular day, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the average utilization. Your peak can be very different from your averages, but you still have to keep an eye on the peak because if you hit over a certain threshold, obviously people don't have anywhere to sit, and that can cause a lot of problems. The interesting stat that we found, and this reflects a lot of what we see around the industry, is average utilization tends to be for a lot of companies around 45%. That is also the intention behind this webcast, is to help people move that needle, because essentially what that means is on average more than half of your space is not used, and it's a huge waste in our opinion. The third key metric is person to desk ratio, and what that reflects is how many people are assigned to each desk, and that is really your lever that you're going to use to make changes. And what does person to desk ratio mean for example, for an organization that has fixed desks? It means that you have a 1-to-1 person to desk ratio, but then you start as you become more either adopt activity-based working, flexible working, your person to desk ratio naturally changes, and you can go from 1.1 to even 1 to 2. Some of the average costings, and why, again, this is important, why a lot of organizations are starting to move towards optimizing versus necessarily moving offices. With a 45% utilization, in London, with average desk costs being around nearly 23,000, per annum, and New York hitting $16,000 per annum. The average wastage, as it were, kind of becomes 6.2 million in London and 4.4 million a year in New York. And these stats, if you want to dig into these stats, they come from Cushman Wakefield's survey. This is reflecting an average office of about 500 desks. One of the interesting, I think, numbers that is coming out of the industry again is, a lot of people are trying to hit kind of around 80%, and it's a great ambition to have, but a lot of the things I talk about is actually let's concentrate on moving the needle by a small amount. So kind of moving the needle by like 10%, taking the London stats means it's kind of a savings of 1.1 million a year. Moving the needle by 20% or increasing the kind of utilization by 20% means it's 2.8 million a year. That's reflected in obviously other cities depending on individual desk costs, but these are kind of staggering numbers. For most people that are at 45% right now, kind of small changes actually make a massive difference. I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Vu. He's going to kind of talk about practical ways of making some of these changes and hitting the metrics that a lot of people are looking for.
So you have the average utilization and you have the peak utilization that you need to keep an eye on, that you cannot go above certain threshold. And then you can play around with the person to desk ratio. What we have found based on the customer we are working with, there is no fixed industry benchmark. It all depends on your particular organization. It varies across different buildings, across different teams, especially within different departments. So let's say if you have a sales team versus a HR team, they may have completely different desk person to desk ratio, because maybe the sales team is traveling a lot more, maybe the HR team is in meetings most of the time. They don't use their desk as often. But what we have found out is for average ratios between 1.2 to 2 is kind of like a workable solution for most of our clients. So now that I've talked about desk ratios, I want to show you multiple different ways where there are simple things you can do to start adjusting the person to desk ratio and increase utilization. The simplest way is to have the data and break it down by utilization bracket. So as in this example, you can see there is 44 desks in this particular office that have utilization between 0 and 10%. And you have 105 desks that use between 10 and 20%. This is actually a very typical bell curve within a single office, and the average is between 30 to 40%. That means, most of the time people are running around having meetings and do whatever they do at their work, but they're not always sitting at their desk. So the simplest thing you can do in this case is to convert the 44 desks that are not being used almost at all from fixed desks to flexible desking. So you can say, 44 desks, you can serve instead of 44 people, you can serve maybe now 60 people, 100 people, and that could potentially save you up to $1 million a year. The second way you can do this is, what we hear a lot is, my department head doesn't want to allocate, to give up some of his desk or her desk. He said that they're using it all the time, but when you have the data, you can compare them and you can come with the data to them, say, okay, in this case, you guys are not really using your desk, right? You can say in case of sales versus product, for example, as in this chart, you can say the sales department is using the desk actually quite a lot, but the product team, they only use it 35% of the time. That means you can allocate some of the desk from the product team to the sales team. That's another way you can increase the number you can have in the office. A third way to do this is by looking at the distribution over the week of the work week. Some offices, Wednesday is the busiest day, Friday tends to taper off, but depends on your office. You may have some days that are quite busy, like in this case, Monday, since they have a lot of meetings, they schedule a lot of meetings on Monday, not sure why. The office is quite packed, but if you have this data, you can talk to some of the department heads. They can start changing their meeting schedule. They can allow some people to work from home, becoming more flexible, so that your office can never go above the peak. And to do something like this, you can allow your employees to look at the live view, which show you the utilization data at the moment. so people can decide when they can come into the office, if it's too busy, if it's empty, where they can find where to sit. So for folks who have manage multiple sites and buildings, what we have seen is there's quite a huge difference between different sites. If you have multiple sites within the same city, you can have some places that are quite busy and the other place not so much. Having the data will allow you to allocate spaces. So some of the employees may decide to work from another office to make so they don't pack into one single large building. But it also might help you decide if you can close one office and move people to another one and distribute the workload and the desk distribution. And the last is quite important as well, especially when you manage larger portfolio of buildings, is the ability to predict and forecast utilization over time. So given if you have the data for average utilization and peak utilization over time, and you can see how your headcounts grow or decline over time, based on that, you can forecast different scenarios. Like if you headcount gonna grow by 15%, if it's gonna go by 10%, or let's say if you need to scale down and remove 5% of your headcount. Giving the data, you can predict and forecast it and decide if you need a new office, how you can move people around and allocate desks per floor, department, building, and so on. Now that I have talked about 5 relatively simple ways that you can start managing utilization by changing the person to desk ratio, by allocating people to different places, I want to give it back to Yodit, who can tell you what is the next step and what is the process of managing some of these changes.
Thanks so much, Vu. The average, the peak utilization rates are really the things that you should be keeping an eye on. Point that I think we always have to emphasize, there's no one size fits all. It varies from company to company. Obviously, it varies from city to city and different buildings, but it really varies greatly between the different teams. The difference between the working patterns between kind of a finance team and a sales team are going to be completely different. Getting your arms around that in some ways is hugely important. From our side, we really like iterative steps. We're against this approach of big bang change approaches. They can be very disruptive, and what we like to see more and more of, and I think people that get the most success and the least amount of pushback from employees is much more of an iterative approach. So let's say that you start tracking data, let's call that day 0. You kind of think about, okay, let's tackle one department or one team and identify that, and really let's optimize that first instead of just kind of creating chaos everywhere. The step that most people forget is really getting employee feedback. The subjective feedback of the people that are using that space is super important. For most people, yes, you want to optimize the space, but you want to ensure the highest level of happiness and productivity of the people that are occupying that space, and really get their buy-in, because they really fundamentally understand what is necessary, what kind of collaborative areas are necessary, and so forth. So a lot of the survey tools are great. We like them a lot. We use that much more objective, I would say, data of the sensors or kind of surveys to combine with the more subjective data about how employees kind of rank the space, and use that to make the small adjustments, and then kind of go back, look at the data, and slowly work through the changes. And I think this is super important. The term a lot of people are using is data-driven management of these spaces. That is our approach. We'd love to hear about, if you have an approach, please do give us a shout at the end of this.
Thank you, Yodit and Vu. That was really informative and lots of really good insights and tactical solutions a lot of people could take back to the office and start executing if it's the right approach for them. I think a lot of the things that we've talked about in this session today really kind of covered the key things you need to really think about. So your key metrics, what are they? And then looking at changes you should actually utilise and make sure that they are the right approach for you and your size of the company. So as we move into the Q&A session, there was a number of questions that have come through. We may not be able to cover every single question, but we'll reach out to you individually and we'll send a response out. So moving on to the first question that's come through, I think this one might be for you, Vu. And so the question is, do I need to deploy sensors at each desk?
So there's no simple answer, right? It all depends. So if you want to optimize for large office buildings, you have thousands of desks or at least even few hundreds, and you're thinking about how to optimize even by 10%, then you might not need the sensor for every single desk. You can do installation every other desk, which cover about 50% of all the desks. We have tests based on multiple different clients' data, and the margin of error of that kind of deployment is between 3 to 5%, which I think is quite good enough for large optimization. But if you want to optimize and try to move the needle on a small chunk of department when you already have done all the other large one, you will need sensor for every single desk. That is the only way to get the most accurate data to make small changes.
Brilliant, thank you. And so our next question is around numbers. So I think this one might be for you, Yodit. When does a project usually break even?
So the simple answer is it depends on a number of variables. It depends on obviously the number of desks. I went into kind of the per desk calculations on average in the earlier slides. And it also depends on how quickly you start making changes. What we recommend is gather data for at least a month and then you can start making changes. If we go back to the kind of ROI calculation, a lot of these projects really pay for themselves very early. So for example, if you increase utilization by 10%, the kind of the potential savings in pounds is £1,000 a year. And that is much more than any of these projects would cost in terms of your time or even purchasing the sensors and so forth. By 20% increase in utilization is something like £1.4 million, UK pounds in London. It depends on kind of the size, the deployment, as Vu said, how much you're going to optimize by, as well as the timelines.
Okay, so moving on to our next question. This is a big one I think everybody has been concerned with since GDPR came into play earlier on in the year. So the question is, how do you deal with privacy concerns? And I think this might be a question for you, Vu.
So we don't know about how other people are doing it, but our sensors, they don't collect any personal data. The sensor only measure if anybody is at the desk or not. There's no way to identify, there's no way to link back to a particular person. We are trying, right, obviously we operate in Europe, we are GDPR compliant, and we also have a policy that we work with our clients to talk to the employees, explain what is going on, how we do install, what each of the sensors are measuring, and so on, to make sure people understand that nothing, that we collect can be linked back to a particular employee.
Moving on to the next question, and this is a very interesting one. So the question is, the biggest challenges we face is tracking occupancy. What type of sensors are available to do this? And I think this question might be for you again, Vu.
So there are multiple different technologies. The industry is quite new, so they are obviously evolving very rapidly. And you can hear a lot of different terminology, hardware, and how accurate they are. But we have done a lot of research around this. PIR, passive infrared sensor that detects body heat, that can be attached to a desk. That's give you the most accurate measurement. But you can have also people counters that count how many people are in a room. That's especially useful for meeting rooms or footfall area. Then you have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth technology that kind of do a triangulation for people based on their location relative to the router or gateway. And then a badging system. People check in, they can walk through, scan their badge, walk in. So each of these systems have advantages and disadvantages. For example, Bluetooth, while it can identify proximity of where you are located on a floor plan, it can never tell you if a person is actually sitting at their desk or they are walking around near a desk or they're just passing by and so on. The badging system, what it does is identify the people walking through a gateway, like the front door entrance. But after that, you don't know what they do when they're inside the building. What you get is just how many people are in that single building, but you don't know how they're using that space. So based on that, what we recommend is using either PIR sensor or people counters for meeting rooms.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question we've got coming is, Can you confirm what cost per desk includes?
I can take this one. So the cost is based on everything included to operate a single desk. That means, electricity, cleaning, rental, and everything, but it doesn't include the salary of a person using that desk.
I can link the Cushman and Wakefield survey. It's all online for the different cities. It's really actually really interesting.
And the next question we've got is, what do you think about peak average utilization as a metric?
I think peak utilization is very critical, especially as the spaces get busier. The JLO kind of study was you might spend, say, $100 on salaries as an organization, $10 on rent, and maybe $1 on utilities, right? Obviously, what we're talking about is optimizing for the second metric, which is the $10 that you're spending on lease. But the last thing you want to do is impact the actual people. So, as you hit like peaks of, over 80%, you have a real danger that people are walking around and not finding space. So really kind of staying between the kind of the 70 to 80% bracket of utilization, I think is the sweet spot for most people. Most people are far away from that bracket anyway, so if they get to it, that's incredible. But I would say kind of keeping a very close eye on those peaks is super important.
Key here is not to get some industry metrics like 80% or 1.5 person to desk ratio, because there's not a single measurement that works across all different companies and organization. So what you should be thinking about is, use that metrics as a way to track improvement. Make sure that you always get the feedback from the employees working in a single building, and then make some small changes to make sure that you don't do anything drastic that you have to revert, right? So for some people, peak would be 60% would be fine. Some people would be 80%. It varies, quite significantly across different companies.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Yodit. And now that brings us to the end of this broadcast. I'd like to thank everyone for joining our session.
And just to add one more thing, and again, I really appreciate your time, everyone. We're going to try to do these webcasts quite regularly because we get a lot of these questions, and the spirit is obviously to share information and help everyone else grow as well. So if you have things that you want to learn about in the future, do let us know as well. We're going to kind of keep this cadence going, and just get kind of information sharing and publishing this information, and hopefully you get value out of it. So do participate. We'd love to hear from you.